Hello friends, today let's talk about the pros and cons of different ways to obtain a residence permit in Montenegro. We'll discuss obtaining a residence permit through real estate by opening a company, through employment, through study, for medical treatment, on the basis of yacht ownership, and obtaining a residence permit for digital nomads. I'll start with real estate. The basis for obtaining this type of residence permit is the purchase of real estate, or more precisely, not even the purchase, but the ownership of real estate of any value. This applies to both residential and commercial properties. Please note, not all types of real estate are suitable. For example, if you buy a garage is considered neither residential nor commercial property. Accordingly, if you buy a garage or a shed, for example, you cannot obtain a residence permit on that basis. But if you purchase an apartment, an office, a shop, and so on, you can obtain a residence permit based on such property. Currently, a residence permit is granted for the purchase of real estate of any value. Although, of course, it is obvious to everyone that sooner or later a price threshold will be introduced, and as in other European countries, a residence permit will only be granted if you purchase property of a certain value. For example, in Bulgaria, you can get a residence permit if you buy property worth 300,000, in Spain 500,000, and so on. That is, everywhere except Montenegro and Serbia, some kind of price threshold has existed for a long time, and sooner or later such a threshold will appear in the Balkans as well. In fact, the relevant law is already under consideration, but no one knows whether it will be passed or not. There are no monthly expenses required to maintain this type of residence permit status. There is no right to a kindergarten. This is, in principle, quite logical, since you are not officially employed anywhere in Montenegro. Accordingly, no one prevents you from taking care of your children yourself. Simply put, a kindergarten is not needed. There is a right to a free public school. And by the way, the right to a free public school exists regardless of the basis on which you obtain your residence permit. Therefore, I will not talk about schools any further. There is no right to work in Montenegro. Basically, as in any other country, there is an opportunity to obtain a residence permit on the same grounds. There is no right to conduct business. If you want to do business, open a company in Montenegro and obtain a residence permit on that basis. There is a right to obtain permanent residency and citizenship. The next basis for obtaining a residence permit is a residence permit through a company. This is the most popular way to get a residence permit because it is cheap, simple, and accessible to everyone. The basis is working in your own company as a director. The monthly expenses to maintain the status consist of payments to an accountant, taxes on the director's salary, that is, on your own salary and bank commissions. If the company is open not only for obtaining a residence permit but also conducts business activities, then accordingly various taxes are added. Corporate income tax, tax on receiving dividends, employee salary tax, and possibly VAT, and so on. You have the right to a kindergarten spot, unlike with a residence permit based on real estate, since here, once again, it is quite logical. You are working, you are busy all day, you are managing your own company, so you have the right to a free public kindergarten. There is no right to work in Montenegro, but many people who want to work make a contract between their own company and some other company, and based on this contract, one company sends its director to the other company to perform some kind of work there, for example, regular cleaning of tourist apartments or for something else. Of course, you have the right to conduct business. You also have the right to obtain permanent residency and citizenship. But keep in mind that you can only obtain permanent residency if you meet one small condition, which in principle everyone fulfills. You can get a residence permit to permanent residence provided that you own at least 51% of the company's share capital. In other words, you shouldn't open a company there with 2 or 3 friends. Each friend needs to open their own company. That way, each person will have the right to permanent residency and citizenship. Next, employment. There are a huge number of foreigners working in Montenegro, but relatively few Russians among them, although there are some as well. The basis is employment in a Montenegrin company. There are no monthly expenses required to maintain this status. Yes, you work and you have taxes, but these taxes are either paid by your employer or deducted from your salary, so you receive what is called a net salary. In other words, you could say that you have no monthly expenses at least. You don't pay anything extra beyond what the employer is required to pay. You are also entitled to send your child to kindergarten. Naturally, you have the right to work in Montenegro. In fact, you obtained your residence permit on this basis because you are employed. However, you do not have the right to run a business. And pay attention, you also do not have the right to obtain permanent residency or citizenship. Permanent residency and citizenship can be obtained, let me digress a bit, by opening a company, or by purchasing real estate, or through study. We'll talk more about the study option in a moment, I'll explain it in more detail. There are some nuances there. So, the next basis for obtaining a residence permit is study. Reason, granted on the basis of studying at a university. In other words, by enrolling in any university, you can obtain a residence permit on that basis. We provide services for admission to 2 universities in Montenegro, those universities, where you can enroll without knowing the language and with a guarantee. Their descriptions are available on my website, Europa Edu.ru. You can take a look, everything is described there in detail. There are basically no monthly expenses to maintain the status, but you do need to pay for your studies. The cost varies depending on the university and the specialty, but it's roughly from 1,350 euros to 2,000 euros per year of study. So you can divide that by the number of months to get the monthly amount of expenses. You do not have the right to a kindergarten spot. But if you get a job and the student visa does give you the right to work, then you gain that right accordingly. You do have the right to work in Montenegro. Moreover, unlike most other European countries where there are certain restrictions, in Montenegro there are no restrictions at all. You can work as much as you want. You do not have the right to run a business. But since your type of residence permit allows you to work, it does not prohibit you from working as the director of your own company. So, you can open a company, hire yourself to work there, and you will then gain the right to conduct business. The right to obtain permanent residency and citizenship formally exists, but there is one rather unpleasant nuance. The time you spend studying in Montenegro counts toward permanent residency as only half. That is, if you open a company or buy real estate, you can apply for permanent residency after 5 years of living there. In order to apply for permanent residency through study, you need to study for at least 10 years, which I think is unlikely to fit your plans. So, temporary residency based on medical treatment, this is probably one of the least popular ways to obtain temporary residency. Nevertheless, it does exist, and some people occasionally legalize their stay this way. You can get temporary residency in Montenegro by paying for medical treatment, and you will receive it naturally and logically for the period you have paid for the treatment. There are no monthly expenses to maintain the status, but you do need to pay for the treatment. How much will it cost exactly? Well, it will cost as much as you end up spending. You do not have the right to a kindergarten spot. You do not have the right to work in Montenegro. You do not have the right to run a business. As for the right to obtain permanent residency or citizenship, I have no idea. The law does not mention this. But considering that you are unlikely to pay for treatment for 5 years, I think probably not. Although, formally, maybe you do. Simply put, the law does not say anything about this. A residence permit based on yacht ownership, actually. Not even on yacht ownership, but more accurately, on paying for marina rental, meaning the place where yachts are docked. The length of your residence permit will match the period for which you paid for the marina, but not longer than 1 year. And accordingly, it can be renewed every year. There are no monthly expenses in the form of any fees or taxes, but there are costs for paying for the marina. The expenses vary depending on the marina and the size of your vessel, so I can't specify them here. Well, it depends on the length of the rental. I can't even give an approximate figure for these expenses, they're different for everyone. There is no right to a kindergarten for the same reason as when obtaining a residence permit through property ownership. Since you are not working and have free time all day, you are expected to take care of your children yourself. Why would you need the right to a kindergarten? There is no right to work or to conduct business in Montenegro. The right to obtain permanent residency or citizenship is not addressed in the law. We interpret it as follows. Since the law does not state that it is prohibited, it means it is not prohibited, and therefore it is possible to obtain permanent residency and citizenship. And finally, the last thing left to discuss is a residence permit for digital nomads. This trendy new basis for obtaining a residence permit that has suddenly appeared in many European countries. Well, someone came up with it, and other countries copied it. I believe that obtaining a residence permit on this basis is absurd, but if you want it, we can arrange it for you. The basis. The residence permit is granted for remote workers. That is, you provide services to someone remotely, and if you have a contract with this employer and the contract clearly states that you are working. Moreover, pay attention, discussion is specifically about employment, not about providing services. You cannot run a business. So, freelance singers, it is often called in Russia, is not considered employment, it is business. Business can only be conducted on behalf of your own company. But you can work remotely for any employer That is, the employer pays you not for providing services, but specifically a salary. So most likely though, it depends on the country. And there may be some nuances. The employer is probably paying some taxes on that salary. That's it. In other words, you are officially employed by them, or perhaps you have your own company in some country, for example, in Russia or Ukraine. That is, you can also work remotely for this company as a director. In other words, you have an employment contract with the employer, whether it's your own company or not, doesn't matter. This contract clearly states that you provide services remotely via the internet, and accordingly, with such a contract, you can use it as a basis to obtain a residence permit in Montenegro. If you're interested, write to me in any messenger and I'll send you instructions on how to do this. By the way, this also applies to other grounds for obtaining a residence permit. Message me in the messenger and I'll send you the instructions. There are basically no monthly expenses to maintain the status, but you do receive a certain salary abroad. In Montenegro, as in other European countries, if you earn something abroad, it doesn't mean you can just quietly pocket the money and spend it freely there. It means you have to report this income and pay taxes on it. In Montenegro, compared to other European countries, the tax is relatively low, only 15%. Of course, it is not paid in all cases, but only if there is no agreement on the avoidance of double taxation between the country where your employer is located and Montenegro. If such an agreement exists, then you need to find it, open it, read it, and see in which country and to what extent you are required to pay taxes. Obviously, if such an agreement exists, you should not pay taxes in both countries, but only in one of them. The right to kindergarten, to be honest, I don't know. I think that probably, as in all other cases, if you are not working in Montenegro, then you do not have the right to kindergarten. But I don't know for sure and haven't encountered this myself. There is no right to work in Montenegro. There is no right to conduct business in Montenegro. There is also no right to obtain permanent residence or citizenship. And this is the main reason why I believe that obtaining this type of a residence permit is simply absurd. Yes, you save a little compared to opening a company, but let's be honest, you're basically saving pennies. It's a very insignificant amount of money, and to give up the opportunity to obtain permanent residence and citizenship in the future just because of significant expenses is simply foolish. That's why I believe that the smart basis for obtaining a residence permit is either by opening a company or by purchasing real estate. Everything else, to be honest, is pretty mediocre. And as for the residence permit for digital nomads, I personally would definitely not get it for myself. The maximum duration of stay in Montenegro with this type of residence permit is only 4 years. After 4 years, you've had your visit and then it's back home. I think that's really bad. As for the advantages of obtaining a residence permit on this basis, I can only point out one. There is just one plus to this basis. Everything else is just drawbacks. A residence permit for digital nomads is the only basis for obtaining a residence permit where this is possible. It is issued not for 1 year as in all other cases, but for a maximum for 2 years. And then it can also be extended for another 2 years. So basically, you have to go to the migration office to renew your residence permit a bit less often. But really, that's the only advantage, and it in no way outweighs the drawbacks of not being able to obtain permanent residency or citizenship. Friends, my name is Dimitri. You can contact me with questions about immigration, about obtaining a residence permit, or about accounting services in Montenegro. Goodbye, everyone.